Who will be next is the question being asked by detectives and Italians of New Orleans for over a year. From May 1918 to October 1919, the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, was in a panic over a roaming serial killer dubbed the Axeman. The first to succumb to the blade of the Axeman was an Italian grocer named Joseph Maggio and his wife, Catherine. On May 23, 1918, as they lie sleeping in their home above the Maggio grocery store, the killer cut both of their throats with a straight razor before bashing in their heads with an axe. When law enforcement began to investigate, they found the bloody clothes of the murderer, as he had obviously changed into a clean set of clothes before fleeing the scene. Police ruled out robbery as a motivation for the attack, as money and valuables were in plain sight and were not stolen by the intruder. Near the couple's home, a written message in chalk read, "Miss Joseph Maggio will set up tonight. Just right, Mrs. Tony." The investigators immediately questioned several people, but all were released for lack of evidence. A little more than a month later, another couple was attacked in the early morning of June 27th, 1918. In the early hours of June 27th, 1918, Louis Bismarck, a grocer, and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, who lived in quarters at the back of the store when no one opened the store in the morning, they were discovered lying in a pool of their own blood. They had been struck with an axe in his right temple, and Lowe was hacked over the left ear. Though badly injured, both were still alive. Once again, people were questioning, and one man arrested, but they were later released. Though the crime made newspapers, headlines were more caught up in the fact that she was his mistress. After the attack, one side of Lowe's face was partially paralyzed, and on August 5th, she had surgery performed in an effort to correct it. 2 days afterwards, she died. Before she passed away, she told authorities that she suspected that it was Louis Berzer who attacked her. Berzer was then charged with murder and served several months in prison before being acquitted on May 1st. On August 5th, a third similar attack was made on Mrs. Edward Schreiner, who at the time was 8 months pregnant. As the 28-year-old woman laid in bed, she awoke to a dark figure standing over her and was bashed in the face repeatedly shortly after midnight. She was discovered by her husband, who was just returned from work. Her scalp had been cut open and her face was completely covered in blood. But she survived the attack to give birth to a healthy baby girl. 2 days later, one man was arrested on suspicion, but soon released for lack of evidence. By this time, investigators began to publicly speculate that the attack was related to the previous incidents of Bismarck and Maggio. Just 5 days later, yet another grocer, a man named Joseph Raymond, was attacked on August 10th. The elderly grocer lived with his two nieces, who woke up to the sound of a commotion in the adjoining room where their uncle had resided. The girls entered the room to find that he had taken a serious blow to his head and saw the assailant was fleeing. The grocer, though seriously injured, was able to walk to the ambulance once it arrived, but he died 2 days later due to severe head trauma. The girls were able to provide a brief description of the killer. A dark-skinned, heavy-set man He wore a dark suit and slouched hat. Other clues of the crime scene was similar to the previous ones. The place was ransacked, but nothing was taken. The killer used his own hatchet and blades. The panels of the door or window were chiseled away to gain entry, and that the majority of the victims were of Italian descent. Yet another in the series of murders and assaults by the Axeman created sweeping fear in the city. Police were inundated with reports from citizens claiming to have seen an Axeman lurking in the neighborhood. Axes, chisels, and so on were found in the backyards, and the doors and windows had appeared to have been tampered with. People began to carry loaded shotguns, and their family members took. One report alleged that the Axeman was masquerading as a woman, and another one that he was leaping over fences to get into the yard of his potential victims. The people were afraid, determined to protect themselves, and bordered on panic, but perhaps the heat generated by the terror was something transferred to the Axeman as the killings and assaults stopped as quickly as they had started. Over the months, the fear waned and the neighborhoods returned to normal, until March 10th, 1919, when the Axeman struck again. Charles Cortamagala was an immigrant and grocer who lived with his wife, Rosie, and her 2-year-old child, Mary, in the town of Gridna, just above the Mississippi River from New Orleans. When screams were heard coming from the Cortamagala residence in the early morning hours, their neighbor rushed across the street to investigate. There he found that the three had been attacked. Rosie had been awakened to find her husband struggling with a large man wielding an axe. When her husband fell to the floor, the assailant, she and her daughter, had begged for her lives. Undaunted, the killer slammed the axe down on both her and her daughter. When the neighbors arrived, Charles lay in a pool of his own blood on the floor, and Rosie stood at the doorway with serious head wounds, clutching her deceased daughter. The couple rushed to the hospital, where both were treated for skull fractures. Charles was released 2 days later, while his wife remained in the care of the doctors. Upon gaining full consciousness, Rosie stated that the attack was made by a neighborhood grocer, Lorando Giordando, and his 18-year-old son, Frank, a 69-year-old man who was in too poor of health to have committed the crimes. And Frank Giordando was too big to have fit through the door. Both people were eventually convicted of said crimes. Frank was eventually sentenced to hang, and his father was sentenced to life in prison. After these attacks, New Orleans was again filled with terror and once again began to arm themselves. The police stated that they believed all the crimes had been committed by the same man, a bloodthirsty maniac filled with a passion for human slaughter. Then a new twist upon the scene, when the Times newspaper received a taunting letter on March 14th, 1919, that promised another attack, and also stating that no one listening to jazz on March 19th would get the axe. The music flowed from homes across the city. Much of the city dance halls was filled with it, and professional and amateur bands played jazz at parties at hundreds of houses around town, and no one was killed. For several weeks, all was quiet, but people still lived in fear. On August 10th, 1919, another grocer named Steve Baca was attacked in his bedroom as he slept. Baca awoke during the night to find a dark figure looming over his bed. suffering from a blow from the axe. He survived, and upon regaining consciousness, he ran to the home of his neighbor, where he lost consciousness and collapsed. He was then treated for his injuries, but was unable to remember the details of the attack. Like others who had been assaulted by the Axeman, nothing was taken or stolen from his house. On September 2nd, a local man, William Carson, escaped the lethal attack of the Axeman when he fired shots at an intruder who had broken into his home. The killer left a broken door and an axe behind him. On September 3rd, 1919, a young girl named Sarah Longman was attacked with an axe while she slept in her locked home. When the neighbors came to check on the young woman, who had lived alone, they discovered her lying unconscious on her bed, suffering from a severe head injury and missing several teeth, though she suffered with brain concussion. She did recover. A bloody axe was discovered in the front lawn of the building. Once again, New Orleans was in a state of hysteria, but nothing more would be heard from the Axeman for nearly 2 months. The attack came on October 27th, 1919, when grocer Mike Pipitone was slain. That night, his wife heard a noise and arrived at the door of the bedroom, just as a large axe-wielding man was fleeing the scene. He had been struck in the head and was covered in his own blood. His murder left his wife and 6 children behind. She was unable to describe the murderer with any clarity. This was the last known murder of the Axeman. After this case, the Axeman just disappeared, and authorities to no avail. They continued to work on the case, but there was no real leads. It still remains a mystery to this day who was the Axeman killer.